All right, Bryan, do we have you?
You certainly do.
Well, fantastic. Thanks for joining us today. So this session is titled Back to the Future with Bryan Alexander. Bryan is someone that you may have heard of, you may not have heard of, but I'll get into a little bit more about Bryan in just a second. I want to go into, before I go into all the details, Bryan, of your background. Thanks so much for spending some time with us today. And I know you've been busy through this entire thing, but and you've been back to back with clients and meetings yourself, and I appreciate everything that you're doing, but I appreciate you taking out some time for us today as well.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the hosting.
So a little bit more about Bryan. He's an internationally known futurist, a researcher, writer, speaker, consultant, and teacher, primarily working in the field of how technology transforms education. He often contributes to the Chronicle of Higher Education and interviewed by several national media outlets. He's recently published Academia Next, the Futures of Higher Education, for Johns Hopkins University Publishing. And then he's also a senior scholar at Georgetown University. You can find out more information on Bryan at bryanalexander.org. He's also the host of the Future Trends Forum, which is a weekly open video conversation about the future of higher education. So a little bit about how I came across Bryan. If you read a recent article that I published on LinkedIn, as everything started going into shutdown and I started seeing what was happening with universities, which wasn't surprising. I've seen universities shut down during epidemics before, so that wasn't that surprising. But not to this scale, not countrywide, not worldwide. And as everybody was really beginning to focus on how they were going to respond to their residents, how they would respond to their employees, especially in the off-campus world, as universities were trying to figure out what they were going to do to come back from spring break, or how to get their students back after spring break in order just to get their stuff, because I think we all knew that the classes were going to go remote for the remainder of the semester. Those 3-week kind of delays or extensions of spring break was something just to help everybody get their hands around it. Being a consultant and kind of away from the madness of what everybody was dealing with in the weeds allowed me to really start focusing on the questions that were top of my mind, which is, what is this next fall going to look like? And as I began looking through different publications and reading reports, I came across Bryan and his Future Trends Forum and some of the things that he was writing about, and I just started absorbing as much of it as I could. He's a fantastic person to kind of bounce ideas off of and really try to understand, well, what are the what ifs? And when he says he's a futurist, he definitely fits the bill for that. And Bryan, I just welcome you today. And if there's anything else about yourself, I know Academia Next came out in January, and I know you're already working on something else. So if there's anything else you want to let the audience know about where they can get in touch with you, go ahead and do that while I'll start switching over to our other slides.
Well, thank you for that very, very kind introduction. I really appreciate it. I am a futurist working in higher education. I teach classes part-time at Georgetown, which is an absolute treat. And I try to think with as many people as possible. That's why I try to convene meetings and try to network, and I try to crowdsource as well as to hold as many conversations as possible. I think we're a lot smarter if we think together than if we think by ourselves. And at some point, one of my cats may decide to climb my head, apparently. They're very excited by this presentation, Wesley. Just so you know.
Well, hey, let's go ahead and talk about the article that you came out with in March and followed up with in April with the 3 possible scenarios. I've got those on the screen here now, but if you could kind of go through those three possible scenarios that
Sure.
campuses may be looking at this fall, that would give everybody kind of a frame of reference for some of our discussion.
Absolutely. They're based in part on what happens to the pandemic, how it actually plays out, and then as well as how higher education responds to it. So the first scenario is called the post-pandemic campus. And that's the idea that academic leaders think that they are more or less beyond the peak of the pandemic and that it's safe to reopen face-to-face education. When I published this in March, people weren't sure this was actually going to happen, but it's starting to happen, and we're seeing more and more announcements of this. COVID fall is different. This is when campuses decide that they will stay online entirely in order to protect people. We just days ago with the announcement from the California State University system. And the third is what I call the toggle term. This is when campuses alternate between face-to-face and online during the same semester. It may be that they open face-to-face and 2 months in, we see a major spike in infections, and then they have to shut down the university's face-to-face environment, move entirely online, or they have to switch different populations. So admit this graduate program, but not this undergraduate program. So, I mean, these are the three that I have in mind, and what I've been looking at for the past couple of months. So far, 1 and 2 are the ones that are most popular. Most college universities have not issued a statement for the fall yet because they're all thinking and arguing fiercely about this. But those, I think 3 is one that we're going to see in practice, if not in planning.
Yeah. What are some of your immediate thoughts for with the announcement that Cal State made this week? Do you think? I mean, and it's kind of a follow up from what they said that they were planning on a few weeks ago, but just interested in getting some of your thoughts if you think that's going to play out
Sure.
more and more, or if you think that's going to be a regional decision.
I think it depends. It depends in part on geography, as you said. It depends in part on institutional type. So it's much easier for a non-residential school to move entirely online than one that has an elaborate residential life. Those schools have a lot invested in maintaining everything from residence halls to student life to athletics. And for them, producing this online is both very difficult and also costly in that it'll take time and money to try to reproduce everything from social life to mental health counseling online. But also, frankly, a lot of them make money on dining and housing, and losing that income is going to be very, very difficult for them. I think moving entirely online has some downsides that we've seen over the past 2 months. One of them is that we are finally, for the first time in this country, talking about the digital divide. And the digital divide is deep, it's persistent, it's driven largely by geography as well as by income, and we don't have good ways of crossing it. So we've seen everything from campuses mailing out hotspots to people, to shipping out laptops, to going offline. I saw some tribal schools or heard about tribal schools where the campuses were sending printed materials to students and students would ship them back. And so that's one of the challenges. Another is just trying to support students mentally and physically when they're not physically on campus. Everything from mental health to advising to, of course, meals. I mean, this is something we've seen in K through 12 is that a lot of students depended on hot lunches and hot breakfasts at schools. Without that, there can be an issue. And we've already seen this in higher education as well.
Yeah. So that kind of ties into my next question. Just reflecting on spring 2020, what's a couple of the wins and losses by the higher ed industry in responding to the outbreak and trying to protect everyone?
It's a fun question. I think the biggest win that is just astonishing is how quickly we migrated to wholly online. We haven't done this in higher education before. This is truly astonishing. Just how much teaching, how many classes, how many student interactions went online in some cases, a few days, if not a few weeks. I mean, that's an astonishing achievement. And alongside that, another win is that we now have all that experience to draw upon. A couple of losses. One is that we are likely to lose some students for whom students who are knocked out by non-academic reasons, such as families being sick or more likely hit by the recession that is so deep and extensive that we'll be calling it a depression pretty soon. That's one of the big losses. But another one is that we have, it's very hard to discuss this out loud if you're a campus leader. Uh, so the discussions can have blowback effects. So if you say, well, we're thinking about moving online this fall, there was a story about how, I believe it was Boston University, published a 12-page article on what they're planning to do this fall. And 11 pages or so were, we're going to be open face-to-face. We're going to do all these things normally. Here's how we're going to do them. And down on page 12 was this note where the president says, well, yeah, we have a contingency plan. If the pandemic is really fierce, then we'll have to be online. Forbes, Fortune, other articles said, Boston University going to be wholly online this fall. You know, it's really hard to be able to have these kind of debates, which is a problem because this is the kind of thing that we need to have in the open. We need to have as many participants as possible. So for me, that's the second loss.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about short-term impacts for this upcoming year. What do you think, the, I don't know, top 3 to 5 issues that institutions are going to be grappling with as it relates to COVID-19?
Sure. One of them is going to be rethinking their entire curriculum as well as non-curricular facets to move online. Even campuses like, say, Brown or Purdue that have made a lot of noises about opening in the fall have to be preparing contingency plans for this should the pandemic pick up again. A second thing to worry about is financial. If you're a public university, the odds are good that your state government will spend less on you next year. They will cut that kind of support for all kinds of reasons I can talk about if you want. A third issue we have to be grappling with that everyone will have to be considering is the possibility of an enrollment decline because a chunk of students will not want to go to a physical campus because they'll be afraid of infection or because they can't afford it. And another issue to think about is if a campus is actually open or it's online, how do you support the faculty and staff who are statistically in the danger zone for infection?
Yeah.
Faculty who are over 55, say, or who have one of the comorbidities, i.e. Diabetes, for example, or hypertension. It's got to be tricky to be able to manage these. And on top of this, I think the other issue is we have a national political season that's just going to ramp up through November with the election. And there's going to be flashes of connection with higher education, everything from trying to convince Congress to give us money in the different stimulus packages to different politicians who will take stances about higher education, everything from politics to enrollment to classes to institutional structures. And so that's another issue we have to grapple with.
Yeah, it'd be an election year, presidential election year. Just, that was one of the first things I've kind of pointed to because, any politician's going to use anything that they can get their hands on to throw at one another. And I think that's going to be pretty sad when it comes to a lot of the decisions that, unfortunately, a lot of universities are going to be, their administrations are going to be put in, in the middle of. So hopefully that's mitigated somewhat, but time will tell. So let's move into a little bit more of the long-term impacts. And I've got kind of a two-part question here, but looking at the next 5 to 10 academic years, how does this pandemic change higher ed, both from an institutional perspective as well as administrative?
I mean, looking out this far, I think it's important first to remember the different drivers that were acting on higher education before the pandemic broke out. So we want to think about things like the importance of demographics. America's population, like the population of every nation that's gone through modernization, the number of children drops like a stone and the number of seniors grows like mad. And so we've had to figure out how we shift Do we take the 60-year curriculum? Do we take lifelong learning seriously? If so, how do we change programs and develop structures to support that? Second problem is our financial instability, that as costs have shot up, as our tuition has increased, as state support has decreased, we've run into all kinds of financial problems that are still there, and COVID just heightens that. And on top of that, we have a whole series of technologies which both threaten and enable us. And so all of those forces are there that we still have to interact with. Second, the pandemic does some very, very interesting things. One is that it is giving us more research and more experience in teaching online than we've ever had, which has all kinds of impacts. It can make us a lot smarter about our teaching with technology decisions. There can be blowbacks. I'm really expecting to see stories about bad student experiences go, if you'll forgive the expression, viral through the media. I'm expecting to see more and more faculty criticism of teaching online do the same as well. And those are issues looking 5 to 10 years out. I would add one more point to think about. And once we start looking, especially the 10-year period, the subject of my next book is the impact of climate change in higher education. So as we see all these different impacts, such as extreme weather events, such as changes in agriculture, such as, of course, the gradual change of coastal and desert bordering areas, all of these are factors that we have to keep in mind. If we're fortunate, COVID is a kind of what Bruno Latour called a dress rehearsal for dealing with climate change. It reminds us that the natural world does things that we can't necessarily control that well. And we have to act collaboratively at incredible scale and across incredible silos in order to just survive and do this right. I think looking ahead, that's the biggest picture I can leave you with.
Great. Okay. So, what technologies and social practices should we expect to see implemented on campuses in the coming years to help prevent or mitigate the impact of another pandemic or something that's even a little bit more localized?
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, quite a few. And I would love to hear from people in the chat. Does the chat box function?
I've got some on the feed loop side that I can monitor from here. So,
love to hear from folks. Well, one of the social practices is institutional. In fact, two of them are. The first institutional practice has to do with having a kind of emergency administration, having a team that can monitor the world for active intelligence, that can represent stakeholders on campus adequately and fairly, and that can make decisions that involve enough people sufficiently, given the institution's culture, to respond quickly enough. I mean, that kind of emergency team has been developing on campuses all over the US, all over the world, in places that are impacted by the pandemic. I think that become more normalized. A second is, depending on where an institution is located, basically the greater the population area adjacent to an institution, the greater you're going to have some kind of barrier. I think sometimes of Vassar College in New York, which has one side of it, a gigantic stone wall. I mean, medieval thing, right? I don't know if we'll go that far, but how do you maintain a barrier to keep people who aren't involved in the academic mission of the campus or its general mission from intervening and spreading infections? I wouldn't be surprised to see more and more of that kind of cordon sanitaire start to appear. In terms of technologies, it really depends on your sense of equity. On the one hand, you may see a push for lower levels of technology in order to address the perception that students, as well as staff and faculty, don't have access to bandwidth or to hardware or other parts of infrastructure. So you may see a push downward towards, say, asynchronous technologies, learning management systems, discussion boards, blogging, and so on. Mm-hmm. A push for lower density media, so audio instead of video, video instead of VR. You may see emphasis on writing, for example, because text is the lowest bandwidth of all. The flip side of that is you may see a push for higher levels of technology in order to try to get that sense of presence together. So this is one of the great things here in video is that I can scroll here and look at Doug Brown. I can see that Ken Miller actually laughs at my jokes, which is a big plus. Wesley, I can see your studio with your great mic right in front of you. I mean, I can get a glimpse of you all through this technology, and we can do more of that with video, but also this is where augmented and virtual reality come in as well. So you may get a push on that end of the technology to do more. One thing that we haven't really talked about, I think in general, not this hour, but in general, is the huge importance of mobile devices. I mean, outside academia, mobile devices are how the world engages with the digital world. I mean, that's the leading device intersection. Campuses, though, we're still kind of presuming that the laptop or desktop is the way to go. And a lot of our devices, a lot of our applications are still kind of based on that assumption. So we've got to figure out how to really reach out for the mobile world. And one big reason for that, not just people are using it, that's a big reason, but also we know from study after study that the poorer you are in the United States, the blacker, the more Latino that you are, the more likely you are to spend more time on mobile phones doing more stuff with them. So if you're at all interested in issues of equity, then shifting emphasis to mobile is a really key step to take.
How about as far as technology that universities may be looking at to try to get ahead or to help manage, along contact tracing, that type of thing? Do you see a campus where, because I think my thoughts is, that's kind of a perfect. I mean, we could look at South Korea as an example of it, but trying to deploy in the U.S. what South Korea has in place, there will be riots in the streets.
Yeah.
But I think college campuses are something that is probably a good test, and is very much needed. What is your research and just general thoughts on that?
I think whenever you have a kind of security crisis like this, you go into that rethinking of our expectations. Sometimes it's positioned as, civil liberties versus security, for example. And already I've seen some civil libertarians who spent a long time talking about the importance of protecting data. And so, yeah, now is the time to share personal data because it literally is a matter of life and death. On campuses, it's very, very interesting. We were one of the last sectors in American society to figure out that big data and big analytics were actually things. We're still catching up. We're way behind, but we've got ways of doing that, ways to improve student success, ways to improve advising and all this good stuff. At the same time, we have a lot of pushback. We have a kind of older pushback based on a suspicion of technology that misses the richness of human experience. Often this comes from humanists. And I say this in full disclosure. I mean, I am a humanist. My PhD is in English Lit, right? So there's that sense that, you can't track everything of the educational experience through numbers. That's one objection. A more recent objection has to do with suspicion over how mostly companies as well as governments have been misusing data collection and big data analytics. So you have wonderful, wonderful scholars like Zeynep Tufekci and Kathy O'Neill who have drawn our attention to the way that companies like Facebook can misuse our data. And so when it comes to campuses doing it, people want to watch out for that. They want to make sure that campuses keep data secure, first of all, which is non-trivial. And second, that campuses don't misuse it to either reinforce pre-existing inequalities or to make things worse. And on top of that, that students have some say in what some will call a data valence regime. So when it comes to COVID, that debate becomes more fierce in a lot of ways. How much privacy are you willing to give up in order to protect your lives? How much, but it's a public health question, not a personal question. So if you're trying to protect a bunch of 18-year-olds in campus, the odds are great they're not going to die from COVID-19. But the odds are also excellent that if infected, they'll take the virus back to their parents and those parents, which is where the risks really begin to shoot up. So, does this become a way of kind of teaching America how public health actually works, and what needs to be done for it? But at the same time, as you said, riots in the streets, that's not an exaggeration because we've already seen something close to riots
Yeah.
in Cleveland and in East Lansing and in other cities as well. So I think it's going to vary from campus to campus. It's going to vary from region to region. I wouldn't be surprised that if campuses in the New York greater metropolitan area are much more likely to run tracing apps than campuses, say, in Florida.
Yeah. Well, one last question. Thanks again for your time. But you know, you're a professor at Georgetown. I've heard you speak a lot about the class that you were teaching this semester. And I got to think, having you as a professor who knows this technology or education technology very well, that had to be pretty easy to transition. But now that they actually had to be remote, I know you mentioned, you know, even in, I believe, other countries, certainly other states. What's now that it's over with, what's kind of any feedback that they've given you as to they enjoyed it or they hated it, or any feedback at all?
I think they would have preferred to be face to face. Now we did have a kind of high flex hybrid experience in that some students who were physically removed from the class participate online. So we had a student whose job took them to another part of the country, for example. And we had cases where students would be sick, not so sick they couldn't talk, but they didn't want to come to class. Or one time we had just a horrible, horrible storm and people couldn't leave the campus. I think the students missed being face-to-face, that said. And they appreciated what we did to make it all work. And they were glad of that. I think what they were more concerned about was the bigger picture, you know, worried about what happens, the issues that you've been raising, Leslie, with your excellent questions. You know, what happens to privacy in America? What happens to grandparents? Right? What happens to the economy? And I think the class became a place for them where they could think that through and share that. That wasn't easy. I mean, I made a habit of making sure that I checked in on everybody to make sure they were doing well. And thankfully, I mean, they were all healthy. You know, we didn't, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
But that was a seminar, graduate seminar on education and technology. They were the ideal students to think this through. One of my assignments, I don't know if you'll follow this, World Health Organization has been releasing a series of MOOCs aimed at the pandemic. Just today, they released 3. One was on how to dispose of medical waste, and 2 different things about tobacco that I didn't quite follow. But I had my students go through one of these classes, and it was fantastic to see their responses because they had such great intellectual tools for understanding, criticizing, they taking advantage of them. I mean, they were fantastic. Now, today is Thursday. On Monday, I start my summer seminar on gaming and education. So I'm hugely, hugely excited about it. But again, we have to do it all online. So, you know, I've been going nuts trying to figure out ways to do some normal face-to-face encounters online. And I'm delighted to hear from folks about their ideas on that.
I've got a 14-year-old daughter who I think would love to observe that class if you've got any extra. So.
Watch my blog post. I'll have a post about it this weekend.
Great. Well, Bryan, thanks so much again. Thanks for being so liberal with your time today, and appreciate everything that you've helped me out with in the past few weeks as I've been trying to get my head around all of this and how it's, you know, going to impact the student housing industry. So thanks again. And if anybody wants to get in touch with you, of course, on the screen have bryanalexander.org. Any other areas that they should follow you or reach out?
Well, I'm pretty active on Twitter, and so you can find that link from my page. But just Bryan Alexander. So I'm happy to tweet it. And you can always email me directly from bryanalexander.org if you have any questions or comments. But in the meantime, everybody, please keep thinking and working about this, and above all, stay safe.
Thanks, Bryan. I appreciate it.